You're listening to The Wintermaker, read by author Jason Lee Willis. Chapter 50, Fight in the Dog, Split Rock, Minnesota, March 19th, 1962. Chris Looning calculated how fast the floodwaters were rising. Each time he tossed a new sandbag on the earthen dike, he would look across the Crow Wing River for the dead oak tree whose trunk served as a marker for him. When he'd arrived home from school, the water reached the bottom of a crooked branch. Yet within an hour, it was 6 inches from the bank where it had been. Getting tired, Billy Morissette, the man who asked it, was retrieving another sandbag as Chris looked at him. "On my honor, I will do my best," Chris shook his head. 24 men from the lumberyard had built a formidable dike in the span of a day. On the paved lot of the lumberyard, dump trucks deposited loads of sand, which a dozen men filled into bags and passed from station to station until they were stacked into another pile near the bend of the river. At the second pile, Chris and the other team distributed the bags along the bend, the battlefront in the war against the weather. The eastern bank was 10 feet above flood stage, so that was where the sandbag dike began. The lumber mill had been built upon the large bend of the river on ground that was only 5 feet above the floodwaters. With the wall growing bag by bag, the water now had an outright obstacle. But the men recognized the river could backflow into the mill. So while some worked to strengthen the main front, others, like Chris, began flanking the dike. His house was part of this flanking maneuver. From the center of the dike, his house and backyard extended 30 yards before the river cut south. They had made a single row of sandbags that joined the main dike and circled back toward the railroad tracks, which formed the man-made rear of the battle plan. Luckily, the growth of the sandbag wall outpaced the rise of the river. For now. But a scout will help people at all times. A truck came flying over the railroad tracks so fast that the front wheels went airborne until it came skidding to a stop on the gravel. "Steve Knutson!" the man in the truck bellowed. A man near Chris straightened his back after dropping the bag and waved his arm. "Here!" The man in the truck sprinted towards him as Mr. Knutson jogged to cut the distance. "There's been a bus accident involving your daughters. You've got to come quick." The 2 men took off running, leaving Chris stunned. In just a matter of seconds, the truck took off, speeding away across the railroad tracks. His father, who'd been organizing the men filling the sandbags, jogged over to him. "What was that about?" The man in the truck said there'd been a bus accident involving his daughters," Chris meekly explained. "He lives in town," another man said, joining in with them, "up on 7th Avenue. "Steve married a Vite," another chimed in. "The red-haired gal who works at the bank. Her folks live south of town." Soon, all the men had gathered around. From what Chris gleaned, Steve Knutson was the foreman at the sawmill and equal to his father in the hierarchy of Fisher Lumber. His 2 daughters, Molly and Danica, had taken the bus because of the early dismissal to stay with their maternal grandparents, who lived 6 miles south of Split Rock. When the screen door of the house slammed, all the men paused as his mother came out with her overcoat hastily thrown over her shoulders. "There's been an accident with a school bus. It went off the road and fell into the waters of Buffalo Slough." Nothing else needed to be said. The men immediately bolted for their vehicles, and the lumber yard filled with the roar of vehicles speeding away. Chris found himself alone with his mother, who put a hand on his shoulder as they walked back toward the house. The phone rang and she jogged for the door. By the time Chris slipped off his muddy boots, she was mid-conversation with whoever called. She pressed the caller for details about the accident, but all Chris heard was a series of "oh my" and "oh dear" before she stared directly at him with wide eyes. "Which hospital?" After the answer was given, she whispered, "Hypothermia." His mother looked away, and the one-sided conversation continued on until Chris moved to regain his mother's attention. "What happened?" "One moment," his mother told the caller. cupping her hand over the bottom of the receiver. "Jimmy and Biff were on the bus and helped pull most of those kids to safety, but they've gone into shock because of the cold. They're being taken to the hospital in Brainerd." "It's happening." Nicky was right. Our war has begun. Chris shook his head, refusing to believe what he heard. "They didn't take the bus. They were with Alexandra in a car." "What?" "Biff went home with Jimmy and his sister. They weren't on a bus." She turned back to the phone, and for a few moments, she and the caller talked. "What did she say?" Chris asked, impatient. "She was pretty certain about the names being Jimmy Nielsen and Biff Forsberg. Mrs. Crane saw the accident and helped bring the rescued children back to the McPherson farm, where Ida tried to keep them warm. After they called 911, Ida called her brother-in-law Donnie, who brought Jimmy and Biff directly to the hospital because they were the worst off." His mother paused. "I need to call Edna to make sure she knows." "The hospital means they are alive. But what about Nicky and Gavin and Mrs. Crane?" 10 minutes passed without any news of his friends as his mother went from call to call trying to glean information. Overwhelmed and frustrated, Chris slipped on his boots and walked outside. Sandbags remained where they had been dropped, yet the river still roared. The big snowflakes had turned into drizzle. When he reached the dike, he could see that the water neared the upper crook of the oak tree, rising another few inches since he'd left. They were losing the fight. Chris began to walk, following the flow of the Crowing River past his property and into the eastern woods. The recent rains had erased his worn trail in the snow, and now a muddy trail emerged. He followed the path for a quarter mile, and when he reached the monstrous oak, the rope swing was no longer tucked into the board nailed onto the trunk of the tree. Instead, the thick barn rope dragged in the current of the flooded river. The wooden plank and knot that had served as a foothold had been devoured. He looked to the other bank, where the deer stand stood near the shore, and moving between the birch trees, he saw gray figures. Counting didn't matter, for he knew exactly how many he saw. 12 Tokpai. Some stood snarling at him while others slinked through the shadows, heading north. Chris reached down and picked up a rotted branch 4 inches thick and 2 feet long. He hurled it across the river, where it struck the branch of a birch tree before shattering into pieces. Now all the Tokpai were leaving and gave him little attention. Only one stopped and lingered for a moment as its beady eyes stared back at Chris, who reached for another object to throw. He peeled a stone from the cold ground, and by the time he prepared to toss it, the 12th monster followed the rest of the pack, heading north. What if something happened to Biff and Jimmy? Did kids die in the bus accident? Seeing the Tokpai on the opposite shore made some sense. The flowing waters of the Crowing River, which led to the Mississippi and the Gulf and the ocean, served as an eastern barrier. Why were they at the deer stand? If the journal was right, the Tokpai only served one purpose and master, the evil spirit known simply as the Wintermaker. Yet the Tokpai had initially gathered at the deer stand, and more likely than not had used their foul magic to keep him from crossing. Why did they try to stop me from getting to it? He suddenly knew the answer. The dream catcher. Chris ran. His feet slipped from time to time, and once he completely wiped out, falling onto his side. But he ran until his lungs ached. When he burst out of the wooded river valley, he did not follow the road back to the lumber yard or his house. I need an ally. Instead, he ran toward Grandpa Albert's house. By the time he passed the old haunted house in Lions Park, he knew he was close, and when he found the 2 brick pillars at the end of the long driveway, he paused for a moment before pounding on the door. When it opened, Grandpa Albert stood fully dressed in his winter jacket. Grandpa Albert's eyes were wide at first, and he recoiled somewhat in fear, but then he cleared his throat and said, I guess the moment has arrived. I'm glad I won't have to do this alone. Do what alone? I saw them on the other side of the river, heading north, Chris said. They saw me across the river and couldn't do anything. Grandpa Albert nodded. His brow still had yellow bruises from his accident at the boat landing. I think I know where they are heading. They headed toward the garage. Halfway there, Grandpa Albert stopped and winded from his walk. They might be responsible for this foul weather, using it to divide us. We need to gather as many of the others as we can. Chris nodded as they started walking. Jimmy Nielsen and Biff Forsberg just went to the hospital with hypothermia. Yes, I heard it on the police scanner, his grandfather said as he opened the door to the garage. The accident has taken all of them away from us in our hour of need, including Wally. I know I must act, but I don't know what I should do. I do, Chris said firmly, and his grandfather pivoted around to size him up. We need to go to the deer stand. His grandfather listened without judgment as Chris told him his theory, and within minutes the two of them were in a line of cars on Market Street approaching South Street. When they got closer, Chris could see a police car with flashing lights as well as wooden barriers blocking off access to Old Copper Road. One by one, the police officer waved off onlookers, except for Grandpa Albert, who was surprisingly let through the barricade. Is this what drew the Takpai? Chris looked over the strange syllables written by Lily Guerin and cleared his throat. Instead of vocalizing the phrases, he carefully put them in his pocket. Then he heard a strange clicking noise. He flinched, but didn't know where or how to hide. I should report to Grandpa Albert. The second time he heard the strange rattling noise, he stood, peering out the window. 3 ebony ravens sat in the tree. They're talking to each other. What do you want? Chris asked. One raven turned and flew southwest over Old Copper Road. A second raven flew right at him before veering into a northern path across the Crowing River toward Bleeding Rock. The third raven stayed put. It let out a loud, guttural yawn, followed by a hoarse command. Look. Look at what? I'm looking right at you. Look, the raven repeated. The dream catcher. Chris lifted the loom of feather and sinew. Nicky had expected a vision to appear immediately, but when they first looked into it, a spirit from Lake Manitou. Yet they had waited with no results and had left it to check back later. Everyone has forgotten except me. As Chris lifted it up, his eyes looked through the tiny windows within the loom. Nothing. Then he took the dream catcher to the window and pointed it in the direction of the raven, which had vanished. But holding the dream catcher in front of his face, the woods around Crowing River began to change. The trees changed. A face didn't appear at first. Chapter 51. The Halls of Hades. Lake Manitou, March 19th, 1962. Wally Crane took his boat out of gear, allowing the curtain to freely spin him. He sat down in his seat as grief sat upon his shoulders. Thank God I wasn't the one to find her. The nose of his fishing boat hit the soft edge of the ditch, lurching him forward before spinning him like a leaf on the surface of the water. Men on the road were pointing to the slough south of the road. Having served in war, Wally had seen the faces of friends killed by the Japanese, but finding the corpse of a little girl would have been too much to take. Ken! Wally shouted out as Ken Ouzelman crossed the gravel road in front of him. Grab my anchor rope. Wally tossed the rope, and it stretched from the boat to the gravel road. The fire chief picked up the rope, crossed the post of a highway sign, and pulled Wally's aluminum fishing boat onto the slope of the ditch. With the remaining rope, Wally harnessed it and carefully walked to the nose to jump up shore. 30 men, dressed in civilian clothes they were wearing when the emergency call went out, watched as a duck boat fought the current exiting from the culverts. A moment later, David McPherson carried the lifeless body of Danica Knutson to the shore. A wail came from her father, interrupted only by the frenzied efficiency of the local emergency workers. Yes, the girl looked dead, but miracles had happened before with drowning victims in frigid water. Yet Wally held no hope for the girl. A few minutes in the water was one thing. The girl had been lost for a few hours. When the ambulance doors closed, Wally saw Sheriff Don Betzing and Fire Chief Ken Ouzelman standing away from the culvert and focusing on the rising water of Lake Manitou. A crew of deputies sent the do-gooders back to their cars. Dean Holmberg was one of them. He split off from the McPherson brothers, who were consoling David. He stopped next to Wally, whose hands were on his hips as if he looked out at a half-sunken school bus. Would have been a lot more dead if not for your boys. My boys. Wally had only fathered daughters, and at the suggestion of his wife, he'd found his paternal release through his scouts. From his wife's first frantic retelling to Dean Holmberg, Forsberg and Jimmy Nielsen were credited for saving the lives of countless school children on the bus. The kids were ready, but were you? An hour earlier, after Nancy returned home with the girls, Wally had hitched his boat to the truck and had driven right to Chippewa Beach, where he launched it without a dock and raced to the far end of the lake to help search for Danica Knudsen. Now, 2 more souls had joined the others. You get the lowdown on what happened yet? Wally asked. Dean repeated what his wife had already told him about the first 10 minutes of the accident. Donnie got your boys to the hospital before hypothermia killed them. Waiting for an ambulance might have taken the lives of both boys. The Nielsen boy is doing better. He's pulled out of shock. Donnie wasn't sure if the kid was going to make it. That boy is our future. We need all of them to fill the Asante Lodge. How about Biff? The Forsberg boy was a bit blue, but talked the whole way to Brainerd. He helped keep the Nielsen boy conscious. And the rest of the children are going to make it? Molly Knudsen seems like she's going to pull through, even though she was in that lake for quite a while. Damn weather. I talked to Ray Kirkpatrick, Dean began, looking at the angry lake, and the good news is that the Nicollet Dam is holding strong. Apparently, they've got a couple feet left before it flows over all 4 gates. Who do you suppose is tending the spillway gates at the old mill? Wally asked. Oh, geez, Dean said, scratching his head. Steve Knudsen is, isn't he? Marlon Looning sure to think of that. Dean took a step away toward this car, parked up on the hill near the McPherson farm. Sheriff Betzing tried to convince Louis Guerin to evacuate, but he insisted his farmstead was built on a hill. What hill? Wally mocked. The water had already crested over the driveway, making the rest of the farm an island that rose just a few feet above the level of the lake. The county needs to issue some sort of flood warning system for fools like Guerin. This weather is getting scary. Even if it stopped raining right now, there's enough water coming down the Blue Knife to put all those lake homes in jeopardy, not to mention Split Rock itself. Are the Guerins in trouble? Wally asked, looking back to his boat. Nah, he might end up killing his livestock, but his family will be safe waiting out the flood upstairs. He could bring the animals upstairs, Wally joked. Or haul the sheep into the hayloft, Dean countered. I saw he has a big duck boat out front already, Wally said, pointing to the exposed beginning of the driveway. If the water keeps rising, he'll be able to use it to reach Old Copper Road. But I better fill this truck up with gas. I might need to come back and rescue the Guerins if things go sour. Can you give me a shove? Half an hour later, his boat was back on the trailer, and Wally was heading home. Luckily, the roads to Sterling Junction were well built, with steep ditches and hard-packed gravel base. Even at that, the rain, snow, and runoff turned it into a slippery mess. When he pulled into his home, Nancy stood at the front door. Wally left the truck running and the lights on so that he could avoid getting drawn into a long conversation. Nancy would want details, and he didn't want to have to talk about the Knudsen girl until he was done for the night. As he approached, he called out through the glass, I need to get some cash and to go get gas for the boat. Nancy didn't move from the door window. I need you to look at this first, Nancy said, handing him a stack of papers, one of her manuscripts. He accepted it, but took a moment to study his wife. She and his daughters had witnessed a traumatic accident, and while her girls were nowhere to be seen, Nancy didn't seem to be coping. How are you doing? I got the girls to bed early, but when I was in the shower, I suddenly remembered this. Look at it." Wally glanced down. For a decade, his wife had been hammering away on manuscripts that attempted to modernize mythology. He spotted the names Orpheus and Eurydice. "What am I looking for?" "You don't remember, do you?" Wally reread the page. "And Eurydice danced with the Naiads, casting away her fears for her own life, for she knew the only way to escape the halls of Hades was to learn the secrets of the water nymphs that protected their dark master. She needed them to love her, so she drank from their cup and danced along the edge of the water, committing each note and verse to memory. 'I will teach the song to my love, Orpheus,' Eurydice told herself. 'All of this I do for him.' She gave herself to the Naiads, the spirits of the water. When Apollo's serpent learned of her duplicity, 'Why are you showing this to me?' 'The Naiads are water spirits, Wally, the Tokpai. Apollo's serpent, the horned serpent. I dreamt of all of this under our willow tree. Remember how I spoke about my love story, the one between Orpheus and Eurydice? They're both singers.' 'I don't.' 'Nicole and Gavin. She dies and descends into the depths, and he follows her. Something is happening, Wally, here at Lake Manitou. My dreams and reality are crashing together.' Does she mean this? Is she just hysterical? 'Honey, you've had a rough day.' No, don't do that. Don't act like I'm imagining things. I still remember what you said when you gave me that willow cutting as a birthday gift. This is the flood of souls I wrote about, isn't it?' He could read an instruction manual and follow directions, but his wife could look at a poem and find a dozen meanings. Wally looked down at the stack of papers. He'd read all 5 manuscripts and told her each one was wonderful, whether he understood them or not. 'What do you want me to do?' 'I can't stop thinking about Nicole. Is she in danger?' Wally nodded. 'I'd better run into St. John and fill up my boat with gas. Can you fix me up some supper to go? I'll grab it on the way back.' Just then the phone rang, stealing their attention. 'I'll be right back, honey,' he said, handing her the manuscript and turning back to the truck. He'd taken no more than a few steps when Nancy called out, 'Earl, Brian Forsberg is on the phone and needs to speak with you.' Chapter 52. Wet Tweed. Brainerd, Minnesota, March 19th, 1962. The dead girl was wheeled into the emergency room. Separated by only a white curtain, Biff could see them valiantly and violently trying to bring life to the body of Danica Knudsen. His brain finally felt like it was working again, and although his body was wrapped in electric blankets, his head and eyes could still move. Molly Knudsen, the surviving sister, had tubes sticking out of her blankets and a mask over her face. Her parents stood in the opening of the privacy curtain. Jimmy Nielsen slept on the 3rd table. He was also wrapped in rewarming blankets, and after the doctors warmed his blood with a machine, his shivering stopped, and the heart monitor began to count his sleep. Ed, Bonnie, and Alexandra all sat by his side. The chairs beside Biff were now empty. His little sister Julia could not control her crying, and his mother insisted on taking her into the waiting room so the doctors could focus on him. His father, when he received confirmation that Biff was stable, exited toward the waiting room doors. None of them had returned yet. What did they do with my clothes? Inside of his cocoon, Biff was completely naked. The nurses had used scissors to cut off his clothes in front of everyone, and had even squeezed warm water on his groin before wrapping him like a mummy. The curtain opened and the doctor stepped away from Danica, her yellow raincoat and galoshes in a pile on the floor. Warm tears filled Biff's eyes, and he looked up at the ceiling. His breathing became panicked, which brought one of the nurses rushing over. Under the blankets, Biff found his fists clenched in rage. Can I get you anything, Brian? He shook his head. In Donnie McPherson's truck, he'd seen the effects of hypothermia on Jimmy. Lack of coordination, slurred speech, and confusion all took hold of his body. Has my brain warmed up enough to think clearly? Had he known how much it would hurt, he might not have jumped into the water to get the sinking bus. Every cell in his body ached. Because of this, Biff practiced like he was studying for a test. He started from the gravel road, replaying every detail that had happened. The maroon car, the bus, Mrs. Crane, Alexandra, the green Renault in the other lane. Its headlights had been on as it came up Old Copper Road toward them. The bus moved from the center of the road, where its tires found the soft ground eroding by the floodwaters. By the time Alexandra stopped, allowing Biff to climb out, the green Renault had also stopped. And by the time Biff had retrieved the first student, a human chain had formed. The fellow in the maroon car stood beside Alexandra on the road, waiting and watching. Mrs. Crane stood knee-deep in the water at the edge of the ditch, helping the children onto the road. The other fella stood waist-deep in the water, catching and transferring the kids, while... Is it all coincidence? It wasn't a red Thunderbird this time, nor was it a Plymouth, yet the man wore the same derby hat and tweed jacket Biff had seen 9 months earlier, on the same road. Is my brain playing tricks on me? No. Mr. Derby Hat was a man of action. He'd seen the bus slide into the water and stopped. He, too, jumped from his car and ran down to take action, while Alexandra and Mr. Maroon Car just watched. Then he cast aside danger to wade into the water. He didn't think, he acted. Yet when Jimmy was pulled out of the water, Mr. Derby Hat took only a moment to catch his breath before slipping away to the green Renault. Where was it? I know I looked. In Mr. Stevens' Science 7 class, he learned the human brain, taking in data from open eyes, processed countless images of information per second. Even a few hours later, Biff's brain threw away most of what he'd seen to remember the trauma of the overturned bus and the cold needles in his flesh. He couldn't even remember what Mr. Maroon Car looked like. Biff took a deep breath and returned to the moments before the trauma. The green Renault came down the hill, putting its brakes on near the culverts. Then it slowly accelerated toward the convoy. It passed Alexandra's car. Biff looked at it. Mr. Derby Hat sat in the front seat, but it wasn't the white-suited Indian Tarani Basant sitting in the back seat. No, that was another memory. This time it was Miss Olavintiar. His loins tightened the first time he'd seen her sitting at the fire in Nova Scotia, and thinking of her again, his balls felt cold. Sarah. Mr. Derby Hat, ever the loyal servant, quickly returned to her, and they drove off before the emergency vehicles and the law arrived, vanishing like fog upon the surface of the lake. The green Renault drove off toward town while everyone else waited. Why would they be coming to town? Biff pushed his heated blankets aside, and despite being naked, he risked the nurses to stretch his cables to the adjacent wall. With a glance, he punched the button for the outside line. "Hello?" Mrs. Crane answered. "Hi, this is Biff Forsberg. Is Wally home?" "Why, yes, 1 second." He could hear her call out for her husband, and a few seconds later, Wally answered. "What is it, Biff?" He's driving a green Renault and was heading toward Split Rock. Chapter 53, An Old Promise. Old Copper Road, March 19th, 1962. Several vehicles drove up the hill toward the McPherson farm, including an ambulance and a truck driven by Steve Knutson. They found the second girl, Albert Fisher realized as the ambulance drove past the farm. The accident scene shifted into motion as emergency workers down by the culverts and up at the farm also realized the tragedy reached a conclusion. In the somber chaos, Christopher emerged from the woods, looked both ways before crossing the gravel road, and continuing up the driveway to where Albert waited. The sound of an engine caught Albert's attention, and when he turned, he spotted Wally Crane's boat heading across the lake. Chris had to step into the ditch as several vehicles from the culverts drove up to the big yard. Ken Uzelman and Dean Holmberg helped escort David McPherson into the house. Sheriff Betzing, seeing Albert watching with the others, walked over to explain what had just happened. As Albert listened, he added Danica Knutson to the list of deaths. Chris stood beside him, a solemn expression on his face. Albert put his arm around the boy. Sheriff Betzing ended with his update with a gentle, "Now go home. I'll call Wally in an hour once he gets home." Albert guided Chris to the passenger door before walking around the front of the vehicles. Everywhere, car engines were starting and departing the McPherson farm. At the end of the driveway, barricades were set up to prevent anyone from accessing the crime scene on either side of Old Copper Road. "Grandpa," Chris said as soon as Albert sat down in the driver's seat. Chris opened his jacket to show the willow dreamcatcher tucked away. Yes, you have it," Albert said, feeling like the forgetful old man he'd become. From the boy's expression, Albert knew there was more. "What did you see?" "I'm not sure," Chris said, squeezing his lips together tightly. "I first saw ravens, and then it was looking in a kaleidoscope. It's all gone now. I think the magic wore off, but for a bit, it was like looking into the past and the future at the same time." "And what did you see?" "Someone was looking for me." Thoughts of the Wintermaker filled Albert's mind. Years earlier, Lily told Albert about the dangers of the monster that lived in the water, how it was searching for a young victim to become the Omadai. Instead of taking him, Joseph Littletoad abducted McGeesee, offering him as a living sacrifice to the Dark God. Is that what's happened to the Knutson girl? The moment of panic subsided, followed by protectiveness. "Tell me very clearly about this person." "It was a girl, I think. She said her name was Robin." "Robin? What's wrong, Grandpa? Do you know her?" "The loop was closed. I've done my part." "Grandpa?" "Yes, I know the name." Albert had waited a lifetime to close the loop of the past and future. A young Lily was sent under the willow tree in front of the convent, where an old man in a metal chair waited. Months earlier, Albert sat upon his metal folding chair as the apparition of Lily visited him from the past. Closed. Or was it? "There was a young man wearing a black hat," Albert began. "He must be from the future because—" "Levi McPherson. He claimed to be Lily's great-grandchild. He said something about me being dead." "Because of what, Grandpa?" Chris asked, bringing him back to his unfinished point. "Did he say something about the flood?" "Yes, in fact, he mentioned Robin. It was strange, so very strange. He said the Wintermaker was trying to attack the past." "That's what Robin told me, too." Albert felt a chill run through his body. "What did she say?" "She said evil people had been sent to hurt me and my friends. She said a flood would kill them if I didn't do something to help. Robin said she needed me to be a hero." "Think." Albert's fear prompted him to snap, but when he quickly softened, "What did she need you to do to save them?" "She told me to just follow the raven." "Follow it where?" "She told me you already knew where to go." The sawmill. Grandpa? But what do I need to do? Is Nicky Guerin going to be safe? Chris asked. The Guerins, of course. Lily's an old woman, but Nicole Guerin and Gavin McPherson need to... Levi. Yes, Chris. We're going to make sure she's safe. Biff and Jimmy weren't the targets. The Knutson girls were the target. With Steve Knutson and Brainerd and Marlin trying to save the house and factory, no one was minding the old sawmill. Stay here for another minute. I need to let the others know what I need to do. Sheriff Betzing had already left, but Ken Uzelman gathered his men to secure the roads. The weather was getting worse, and night would soon be upon them. The front door was ajar, and a dozen people were still inside the makeshift triage unit. At the center of the chaos, David McPherson shivered under his blankets. Gavin McPherson made eye contact, and Albert motioned for him to come over. From what Wally and Nancy Crane told him, the boy knew much of what was going on. I have to trust him. Can I have a word with you? Albert asked, and stepped out onto the porch. What is it, Mr. Fisher? It's been quite a day, hasn't it? Sure has. I'm not sure it's over. If anything, I think it's just beginning. You think? You know my grandson, Christopher? He saw something. Saw something that led him to the deer stand across the road. Do you know what I mean? Gavin nodded. He knows. Did the dream catcher? Albert nodded. Chris and I are going to drive over to the old sawmill to keep an eye on things. I need you to make me a promise. Sure, what? Albert looked down the hill to the Guerin farm, an island in the growing floodwaters. Keep an eye on the Guerin family for me. Keep Nicole safe. I will. As soon as we get everything sorted out inside, I was going to call her and make sure things are okay. That's a good plan. If you kids need anything, call Wally Crane. I'll do that. Be safe, Mr. Fisher. I'm a soul of caution, Albert joked, and turned to Chris waiting in the car. We'll save the children together, Lily. Chapter 54. The Designs of Jeremy Bordeaux. Old Copper Road, March 19th, 1962. By some accounts, the Bordeaux farm was the first permanent structure built on the shores of Lake Manitou. Although the territory did not open to settlement until the 1850s, former fur trader Jeremy Bordeaux had already built a house, barn, and drying shed along the banks of Canaranzi Creek when the lots went up for sale. Marjorie Campbell, the daughter of a Dakota translator, was gifted the land by Henry Sibley, and when she went to claim it years later, she ended up falling in love with the wily French squatter. Together, they raised almost a dozen children in the same house that watched all 5 of the Guerin siblings grow up. Now, a flood threatened to wash away all the history. After setting down a box, Nikki took a moment to catch her breath. Did I do this? She sensed something unnatural about the weather. I never should have sung those words. Before all the chaos, Gavin had called and tried to tell her something about Christopher Looning, but the message was now all jumbled in her mind. Christopher saw something, and it's probably all my fault. The sweet boy she'd once babysat had gone to the lodge alone and returned with a dire message. The storm then interrupted what Nikki began. She walked through her sister's bedroom and peered out the window. Her father was finishing tying a rope to a post near the corner of the barn. As he walked to the house, his boots sent up splashes from the wet ground, and then the water reached his ankles. And by the time he reached the center of the yard, where the driveway had once been, it reached his calves. Nikki lost sight of him due to the angle of her bedroom window. By the time she ran downstairs, he was already cursing as her mother complained about what a mess he was making on the entryway floor. "Where's Cameron?" Nikki asked. "He's back in the barn trying to get those stupid animals up on the platform," he said before chuckling to himself. "They sure don't like standing on those planks." "Are the animals going to be safe?" Nikki asked as her mother returned with some old towels to sop up the water her father brought inside. Sure, they'll be safe. The barn is built on a rise, and the foundation brings it up another 2 feet. So they are almost 3 feet above the low spot out there on the driveway. And if the water keeps rising, it will flow right around the house and the barn and right into Buffalo Slough. That's why I tied a rope. There might be some current later, and the rope will help us get to the animals. At least your father had enough sense to build the barn on a rise, Nikki's mother said with a tinge of sarcasm. Her father rolled his eyes. He didn't build the barn. He bought it from Jeremy Bordeaux. I'm beginning to see why he got it so cheap. Lily wanted to be close to the lake so she could watch over it. Now, in her hour of need, she's way up at Leech Lake. While her mother tended to her father's wet clothes and brought some hot soup to warm him, Nikki grabbed another box. Even though her father was confident about the water flowing around the house, her mother insisted on bringing the family relics upstairs so they could be safe. She carried a box full of letters, bills, and records from her father's desk, but a moment before she would have set them down, the bottom of the box opened up, dumping the contents on her feet. Oh, for Pete's sakes. She refolded the 4 flaps of the box and began scooping up the paper into some semblance of order. One letter caught her eye. Dated 1924 from Eagle Butte, South Dakota, the letter was yellowed and ripped and addressed to her mother, Miss Hannah Mortensen. The sender of the letter was Fawn White Elk. Dear Miss Mortensen, be warned. I do not write you out of bigotry or disapproval of your youthful betrothal to my cousin's only son, Louis. I write to warn you about the consequences of marrying into a cursed family. My family bears a terrible curse, which you, as a third-generation resident of Hiawatha County, might already understand. But the terrible past is the least of my concerns. I write to warn you of the future. Flee from Lake Manitou while you can. I know you plan to marry young Louis because you are pregnant, but if you give birth to this child, you are dooming the child to a life of misery and perhaps worse. Take your unborn child and run. Run. If you love this child, do not allow it to be part of Lily Guerin's evil plans. Do not believe her lies. I could not reason with her, nor could I convince a son to turn against his own mother, but you still have a choice. Do not marry him, and for the love of God, do not allow your child to grow up near Lake Manitou. Leave while you can. Fawn. Nikki looked to the doorway, folded up the letter, and then slipped it into the front pocket of her shirt. 1924? That would have been Michelle. Learning her eldest sibling was born out of wedlock did not rattle her nearly as much as Fawn's dire warning to run from a marriage. If Mother had listened, I never would have been born. I wonder why she kept this. A few minutes later, Cameron came in, stomping and sloshing just as her father had, much to her mother's consternation. With his help, they quickly moved the rest of the valuables upstairs and then caught their breath at the couch. The 4 of them sat together in the living room, with both the television and radio on. While the radio provided local updates and coverage, the television showed a grander view of how the strange weather had prompted flooding across the state. One report showed a man with a bow and arrow shooting sticks of dynamite into distant ice dams. Bridges, it seemed, turned into dams when the thick ice broke apart on the swollen rivers and collected against pylons. Nikki, meanwhile, thought about Fawn's letter and her own ragged group of friends. While Jimmy and Biff avoided death today, they were taken away from Hiawatha County. The flood threatened both her home and also the home of Chris Looning. Will the water back up and flood us? Cameron asked. It's already over the road south of town, her father said, so it can't get any worse for us. What about Canaranzi Creek? Will the culverts plug? Nikki asked. Most of the ice is already off the lake, so we should be fine. At worst, it has only 3 more feet before it goes right over Old Copper Road. Should we move our furniture upstairs? Mother asked. It should be fine, her father declared. They went on watching the storm as if it weren't merely feet outside of their door. It had been hours since she last heard from Gavin, so when the phone rang, she jumped up from the couch and ran into the kitchen. Hello? She answered, but it wasn't Gavin on the other end. Could I speak to Cameron? A man asked. Who is this? Cameron, it's for you, Nikki called, holding the phone out to him. Who could that be? Cameron wondered. When her brother answered, Nikki lingered nearby, listening in. The owners of Carousel Park had heard about the flooding and called the park caretaker to inquire about it. With plans on reopening in the spring, they suddenly grew nervous about their property and baited her brother into babysitting it with the promise of a $100 bonus. Absolutely, sir, Cameron said. I'll call back once I check on the park. When Cameron hung up, she wanted to snatch the receiver to call Gavin, but not with her father at home. In the fall months, her father had been lukewarm about their relationship, but after Cameron's beating, he all but forced her into ending it. He saw the McPhersons as symptomatic of the violence and hatred felt towards Indians in the community. Those damn people, her father kept muttering after hearing Cameron's explanation of the phone call. I don't mind checking. It's $100, Dad. What if I need you here? I can come back if it gets really bad, and they can keep their money, Cameron insisted. Nikki saw an opening and took it. I should go with him in case he gets stuck. He shouldn't go alone. You've got school tomorrow, her mother began, but with the weather reports on the television, there was an easy counter. Everyone is going to be helping sandbag tomorrow. All the schools near Brainerd are already closing. Cameron and I can play cards, Nikki said, and for impact, she quickly opened the junk drawer and pulled out a deck. Her father nodded and turned back toward the television. It hadn't been the struggle she expected, and in seconds, she was dressed and walking out the door with her brother. They climbed into his car, its back tires parked in the growing swath of water dividing the yard. Listen, Cameron, I need to speak to Gavin. It's really important. When we get to the end of the driveway, let me out so I can go get him. I can drive you there. No, I don't want anyone seeing the headlights. If I can, I'll have him drive me back home or drive me down to Carousel, okay? I really need you to cover for me. It's important. Suddenly, Cameron grew somber. It's about the Wintermaker? I think so. The words Nokomis gave you, I just need to get Gavin so I can figure stuff out. Okay. He started his car and backed deeper into the puddle before driving forward. She could see the second hill her father spoke of, and the driveway rose out of the water. But on the other side of the hill, the water covered the driveway where it turned toward Old Copper Road. How can you tell where the driveway is? Nikki asked, suddenly panicked. I can see the fence posts on both sides of the ditch, Cameron explained as the car entered the larger puddle that had been 2 fields the previous summer. I just need to keep it centered between the posts. We should go back and get the boat. Cameron stopped and opened his door. See, it's only a few inches deep. If you go off the driveway, it'll be a few feet deep. Roll down your windows. Why? In case I drive off the driveway, we'll be able to get out. Cameron let off the brake and lightly stepped on the accelerator, creating a wake as the 4 tires cut through the water. Oh, shit, Nikki said as her feet got wet. We're sinking. Water came roiling up underneath the passenger seat floor mat. It's rusted through the floor, Cameron explained. We're fine. We're going to get back up the hill now. Cameron was right, and the bulge of water that came from the floor mat slowly drained away. You really need a new car, Cameron. At the top of the driveway, he stopped. Are you sure you don't want me to drive you there? It's raining hard. No, I'm fine. Maybe we should stay together to be safe. Wait, can you even get to Carousel Park from here? They've closed the road where the bus went through the slough. Cameron shrugged. I guess I'll have to go back into town and drive all the way around Lake Manitou. When they reached the McPherson driveway, Nicky hesitated. "Can you wait here for a minute? If I can't get Gavin's attention, I'll stay with you then, okay? Turn off your lights and just wait here for one song, okay?" "I'll wait for 2 songs." "Thank you, Cameron," she said and kissed him on the cheek. Out in the rain, Nicky jogged up the driveway and stood outside, peering into the well-lit big lavender house. As her family did, the McPherson family gathered around the television in the living room to listen to the news. Before long, Gavin rose from one of the green recliners and walked into the kitchen, giving Nicky her chance. She picked up a pebble from the driveway and walked up to the kitchen window. And as Gavin walked to the refrigerator, she tossed it aside against the glass, creating a loud plinking noise. Luckily, he noticed it, and like a confused puppy, tilted his head toward the sound. When she stepped into the light coming from the window, he jumped and took a step back before leaning toward the window. Nicky held her finger to her lips and pointed to the rear door of the mudroom. Gavin nodded, and Nicky ran around to the rear of the house and waited outside the back door. Gavin slowly opened the door and stepped out to stand with her under the awning. "What are you doing?" "You need to finish what you were telling me about Chris Looning." Gavin closed the door, joining her in the cold. "He went back to the deer stand without us. He said he saw not only Tok Pie in the woods, but also someone in the Dreamcatcher." "He saw someone?" Gavin nodded. "There was a spirit waiting for him." "Who?" "He didn't say, or else he didn't know. The spirit warned that evil men were coming to destroy our world, and the Tok Pie were going to rise up and fight them to defend their master. He really seemed shaken up. He told me we needed to get Lily." "I agree. We need Grandma Lily." "When were you going to tell me this?" "I just did. It's been chaos. I didn't have a chance yet." "This is life and death, Gavin. Jimmy and Biff are in the hospital, and Lake Manitou is literally rising from the grave. We need to go get my grandmother." "What, now? Do you have any other suggestions?" "We can't go now. It's almost time for bed." "Evil men are coming to destroy our world, Gavin. We either act or we let people die. It's better to ask forgiveness than ask permission. We need to go now. I just know it." For a moment, Nicky thought she would lose Gavin to reason and routine when he opened the door and stepped back inside. But he reached for keys in his jacket, gently closing the door a second time as he rejoined her. "Let's go get Lily." Chapter 55, The High Road. Split Rock, Minnesota, March 19th, 1962. Chris Looning had never felt so alive, and his grin couldn't be contained as he watched his hunched-over grandfather stealthily slip out from behind a tree and join him at the rear wall of the lumberyard. His grandfather breathed heavily, but his smile could also be seen in the darkness. The plan is working. Earlier, after leaving the McPherson farm, Chris and his grandfather crossed the Crow Wing River at the Doc Jenkins Bridge, drove up Market Street, and ran into a literal roadblock. "All the bridges in the county are closed," the sheriff department deputy told him. "I can't let anybody pass until we get somebody to check out the sinkhole that formed." By the time they turned around to the Doc Jenkins Bridge, it was also closed, effectively dividing the town in half. Grandpa Albert sped up the hill to get on the phone to complain, but no sooner had he made a few calls than he had an idea. "Call your mother," he told Chris. "Let her know you're staying here tonight. But so she doesn't worry, I'll tell Grandma Eunice I'm bringing you home and that I might stay overnight to help tend to the men sandbagging." Night soon arrived, allowing Grandpa Albert to park just off Market Street, and like 2 Green Berets, they snuck the rest of the way. Chris could see the lights on the house and the small army of men helping to keep the factory and house safe from the roaring Crow Wing River just a few yards away. Robin's words motivated him. Evil people are trying to break the loop. Even if Nicky didn't know it, Chris was going to save her. "The coast is clear," Grandpa Albert said. "Follow me." Together, the two of them entered the dark lumber mill. The interior of the sawmill was scarier than any ghost, apparition, or monster he'd faced yet. Shadows and sharp teeth surrounded them, but Grandpa Albert kept a fast pace that Chris couldn't stew for long. Up, up, up they went until they reached a doorway that almost touched the ceiling. "What is this?" Chris asked. "You'll see," Grandpa Albert said, fiddling with the locks and knob. When the door opened, it opened to an even darker hole. "Climb up and over and kick it open with your feet." A small space about 2 feet existed between the roof and wooden wall in front of Chris. "What's in there?" "Nothing. They just boarded it up to keep raccoons and birds out. Just lay down on your back and kick." Chris trusted him, feeling thick old wood boards around him. Once on his back, he felt thinner boards, and with 3 stomps, the left side opened up to the outdoors. The flume! Chris kicked the board clear and crawled out of the warehouse and into the open sky. The flume once carried lumber from the sawmill all the way to the processing plant, but with access to train and truck, shipments of wood just arrived directly at the plant, rendering the flume well built but quite useless. "We'll be able to follow it all the way to the sawmill," Grandpa Albert declared once he found his way. "It's our private bridge." "Will it hold us?" "It was built to hold hundreds of pounds per square foot," Grandpa boasted, "but hold on to the edges just in case. Keep your head down until we cross the river." As they passed, Chris could hear men finishing the wall of sandbags. The men, who came in shifts, knew their jobs depended on saving the lumber mill. "What's going to happen at the sawmill?" Chris asked once they crossed over the river and onto the western bank. "Your father has inadvertently put the Guerin family in danger," Albert Fisher explained. "To prevent his lumber mill from being swept away, he's closed the dam up at Split Rock." "Why would he do that?" "He doesn't know what's coming," Grandpa Albert said, pausing for a moment to catch his breath. He held on to both sides of the flume. "If something plugs the culverts, Lake Manitou will swallow up the Guerin farm, or worse." "What's worse than that?" "Steve Knutson should be watching the sawmill, but he's at the hospital in Brainerd. If the culverts plug, it won't just stop at destroying the Guerin farm. The dam on Split Rock is older than I am, and with enough pressure, it could collapse, sending a wall of water right down into downtown Split Rock." "Dang. Nikki will be doubly impressed with me now that I save her and the whole town." Are you going to be able to make it the whole way?" "It's less than a mile. If I can't walk a mile, I don't. No sense talking about it. Let's get going." While not as grandiose as pulling children from a bus, the mission to open the gates of the sawmill still meant he'd be a hero at the end of the day. As they continued their covert trek, Chris couldn't help but wonder, how did these evil people know about the weather? How could a person, even a sinister villain, know the culvert would plug?